Would you have the courage to forgive those who stole 27 years of your life? Imagine spending nearly 3 decades locked up, isolated, humiliated, and walking out asking for peace, not revenge. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? But that's exactly what Nelson Mandela did. While the world expected fury, he offered hope. While many called for blood, he built bridges. In this video, you'll discover what transformed a young troublemaker from a rural village into a global symbol of freedom and leadership. And more than that, you'll understand how the lessons from his life can change the way you face injustice, challenges, and even your own fears. Get ready to uncover the real story most books simplify. One with the power to shake your deepest beliefs. In the dry lands of the village of Mvezo, destiny began to write a story that would one day change the course of humanity. Rolihlahla, that was his name, and not by chance. It meant troublemaker, or one who pulls the branch of a tree. From an early age, there was a quiet defiance in him, subtle but firm. During games with other Thembu children, traces of leadership and a sharp curiosity already stood out, as if he were trying to understand the deeper meaning behind everything around him. Raised in a royal tribal family, Mandela grew up surrounded by tradition, oral storytelling, and honor codes that shaped his sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about being born into royalty. It was about realizing that leadership isn't demanded with shouts, but earned through example. At every tribal ceremony, at each council gathering, he watched, more attentively than most, the gestures of the elders and the weighty words they spoke. It wasn't just culture. It was an unspoken preparation for something greater. This foundation became fertile ground for a mind that refused to settle. Even as a child, Rolihlahla could feel, without fully understanding, that something was off in the world he lived in. The way some people were treated, the limits imposed by race and origin, all of it unsettled him. His childhood, though simple, was far from blind. In truth, it was a masterclass in observation and emotional awareness. And it was within that environment, between drumbeats and ancestral tales, that the first sparks of what would become a symbol of resistance, justice, and freedom began to take root. The loss of his father, though painful, marked a turning point that set Mandela on a new path. Taken in by the tribal regent, he found not just a new home, but an entire world of possibilities. It was there that education became more than a duty. It became a mission. Amid worn books and strict teachers, Nelson, the name given to him by a schoolteacher, as was common under colonial influence, began to shape his critical thinking. There was power in understanding words, and even more in understanding the world behind them. From his earliest days in school, his hunger for knowledge stood out. He didn't study to please, he studied to transform. He could often be found scribbling ideas in his notebooks, imagining a different, fairer country. With every history lesson, something felt off. The narrative glorified the colonizers while erasing the pain of African people. Even then, young Mandela seemed to understand that true freedom begins with the liberation of the mind. And there, in silence, a powerful dream was quietly forming. Mandela saw in education a way to break through the wall of inequality. While many accepted the roles forced upon them, he chose to question, carefully, intelligently. His learning wasn't just academic, it was moral, and the more he studied, the more he realized that education wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon strong enough to tear down walls and build bridges. Even as a young man, Mandela began to sense something was deeply wrong. A cold, rigid structure where certain doors seemed permanently shut for some. Apartheid wasn't just a policy. It was a constant presence, a silent rule, a lingering stare. He saw firsthand how his people were treated. In the streets, on public transport, in the courts. It stirred something inside him. Why this brutal separation? Who decided these cruel rules? Taking part in cultural ceremonies wasn't just about tradition, it was a reclaiming of identity. At those gatherings, Mandela began to understand the weight of his African heritage and the power of collective strength. Elders spoke with gravity about responsibility, justice, and especially leadership. These weren't delivered through polished speeches, but through stories, rituals, and loaded silences. He learned that to lead is to carry the burdens of others with dignity and strength. From that point on, the idea of freedom began to take clearer shape. It wasn't just the absence of chains, it was the right to live fully, to speak, to be. Mandela started to see apartheid as a structure that had to be dismantled piece by piece. And the more he felt the sting of injustice, the more a drive to act ignited within him. Not for personal glory, but because he understood. If not him, then who? Faced with the imposition of an arranged marriage, Mandela did something unthinkable for many of his time. He chose to flee. He left behind the relative comfort of tribal life and headed to Johannesburg, with no map, no guarantees. There, among noisy streets, sweaty factories, and broken promises, he witnessed urban inequality up close. He worked as a night watchman in a mine and, even with little, kept his eyes wide open. The city was a living classroom, and every injustice was a real-life lesson in how the system operated. It was in this setting that he discovered the ANC, the African National Congress. And suddenly, everything began to make more sense. The conversations, the pamphlets, the fiery speeches, Mandela dove in head first, not as a spectator, but as someone who already carried the weight of the cause in his bones. He enrolled in university to study law, despite the limitations imposed by the color of his skin. He didn't just want to understand the law, he wanted to master it, to use it as a tool to challenge what was wrong from within the system itself. Little by little, the image of the student evolved into that of an emerging activist. Mandela soaked up strategies, listened to other militants' stories, and shaped his own political vision. Johannesburg gave him no rest, but it gave him purpose. He understood that his struggle wouldn't be a solitary one, and that every small act of resistance mattered. The city, with all its harshness, didn't break him. It refined him, and from that, a leader began to rise. When Mandela co-founded the ANC Youth League, he wasn't just launching a new initiative, he was awakening an entire generation to dream differently. Young people who once walked silently, resigned to oppression, began lifting their heads. Inspired by the ideas of Gandhi, Mandela believed that peaceful resistance could indeed shake even the most rigid systems. Instead of stones, he used words. Instead of hatred, strategy. And that deeply unsettled those in power. The creation of the first black law firm in South Africa, alongside Oliver Tambo, was another revolutionary act. Picture walking into a courtroom where every glance tells you that you don't belong. And yet, standing tall, defending those who had no voice. Mandela didn't just practice law. He used every case as a tool to expose injustice. With each legal victory, a spark of hope ignited in someone previously silenced. His role kept growing, and so did the risks. Still, he didn't flinch. He led strikes, marches, powerful speeches, and stayed committed to the belief that justice was worth every sacrifice. More than an activist, he was becoming a symbol. But Mandela knew the road ahead wouldn't be all microphones and cheers. Peaceful resistance had its limits. And deep down, he already sensed that the next step would demand harder choices. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960 felt like a deep wound in an already bleeding nation. Peaceful protesters falling to gunfire. How do you reason with those who answer with bullets? For Mandela, that moment wasn't just a historical marker. It was a personal turning point. He realized that peaceful resistance alone wouldn't be enough to confront a regime fueled by institutional violence. The outrage took form, and with it, a new path emerged. That path gave rise to Umkhonto, we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. Even the name carried weight. No more outstretched hands, but clenched fists. Mandela took on enormous risks by leading acts of sabotage against apartheid infrastructure. He didn't target people. He targeted symbols, railways, government facilities, the very pillars of oppression. This new persona, militant, elusive, earned him the nickname Black Pimpernel, a shadow the authorities couldn't catch. Even while on the run, his influence expanded. From improvised hideouts, Mandela continued to send messages, outline strategies, and ignite hearts. The shift in tone wasn't a rejection of peace. It was a response to a state that refused to listen. He knew the line was thin, that radicalization could alienate allies. But sometimes, shaking the tree is the only way to harvest justice. And he also knew the cost of that decision would soon arrive. In 1962, Mandela was finally captured. Tried on charges of conspiracy and sabotage, he was sentenced to life in prison, a verdict that would change his life and the world's perception of him. He was sent to Robben Island, a windswept place of concrete and silence, where dreams were meant to die. But with Mandela, the opposite happened. There, behind bars and stone walls, his figure grew larger. Prison didn't break him, it magnified him. Each day behind those walls turned him not into a prisoner, but into a symbol. Inside prison, he became a beacon to the world. Letters leaked, stories spread, and the name Nelson Mandela began circulating as a symbol of resistance, hope, and dignity. While he broke rocks under the sun, protests grew outside, international movements rallied, and campaigns chanted his name. Yet Mandela never responded with bitterness. He stayed composed, kept studying, debated with fellow inmates, and treated even his jailers with humanity. That baffled those who expected rage, and inspired those who needed a leader. Robben Island became a school of patience and strategy. He knew that if he wanted to change South Africa, he had to emerge stronger, not angrier. He led hunger strikes, demanded political prisoner rights, and never lost focus. Even in silence, he spoke louder than many free men. His cell became a pulpit, his prisoner's uniform a kind of armor, and slowly the world began to listen. Still, Mandela knew he had to leave that place, and leave it at the right time. When Mandela walked out of Robben Island in 1990, the world nearly held its breath. His steady steps toward freedom echoed across South Africa and beyond. Many expected anger, revenge, fiery words. But what he offered instead was the unthinkable: peace, reconciliation, a future. A man who had lost 27 years of his life stood before the nation and spoke of healing. In that moment, Mandela didn't just reclaim his freedom, he claimed moral authority. Immediately after his release, he began negotiating with the apartheid government. It was a political chess game where every move demanded patience, precision, and courage. Mandela understood that a single wrong step could plunge the country into civil war. So, he sat across from his former enemies and spoke of unity. It wasn't weakness. It was vision. The kind of vision only forged in the fires of suffering and resilience. In every public speech, he reinforced the value of peace and the need for coexistence between blacks and whites. He preached equality, yes, but also responsibility. Mandela didn't seek to reverse the power structure. He wanted to dismantle the system entirely. Slowly, he began to turn fear into hope. The fight was no longer just against apartheid, but against the bitterness that could poison the future. And once again, he showed the world what true leadership looked like. In 1994, Mandela made history by becoming South Africa's first black president. But what impressed the world wasn't just the victory. It was what he did with it. He didn't rule with bitterness or seek revenge. He knew that leading a divided country was more than politics. It was emotional surgery. And from day one, he made his priority clear: unity, bringing together people who had once looked at each other with fear or hatred. It was an enormous task, and he never backed down from it. One of the most symbolic acts of his presidency was supporting the 1995 Rugby World Cup, long seen as a white-dominated sport. Many criticized him for it, but Mandela saw further. He wore the team's jersey, showed up at the stadium, and embraced the Springboks as a symbol of reconciliation. And when they won, the entire nation celebrated, together, for the first time in a long while. That moment wasn't just about sports. It was a political miracle, a reminder that peace sometimes starts with an unexpected gesture. During his time in office, he promoted inclusion, established truth commissions, and invested in education and healthcare. But above all, he kept alive the idea that forgiveness is a revolutionary act. He didn't just want to change laws, he wanted to heal wounds. And as a mentor of a new era, he showed with every action that true leadership is about building bridges where others saw walls. Still, Mandela knew, his role wouldn't end with the presidency. After leaving the presidency, Mandela didn't choose rest. He chose purpose. He founded initiatives, supported campaigns, and turned his attention to the wounds that still afflicted his people: poverty, HIV/AIDS, inequality. He knew that the freedom won at the ballot box had to be sustained by dignity on the plate, access to health care, and open doors to education. It wasn't about fame, it was about responsibility. The same responsibility he had carried since Robben Island, now expanded across the globe. In every speech, he emphasized the importance of education. To him, it wasn't just a tool, it was the master key to transformation. He often said, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world." And it wasn't just a catchy phrase. He invested in social projects, mentored young leaders, and made it clear that knowledge frees where politics sometimes fails. Even out of office, he continued to move mountains with his calm voice. Mandela passed away in 2013, at the age of 95, but left behind more than memories. He left a living legacy. His name became a symbol of compassionate leadership, justice without vengeance, courage grounded in humanity. He inspired presidents, activists, students, even former enemies. His journey wasn't perfect, and perhaps that's what made it so powerful, because he showed the world that even with mistakes, it's possible to choose forgiveness. And by choosing it, transform everything around you. Now that you know Mandela's journey, the question is, what will you do with it? Will you keep accepting injustice as part of the game, or will you start acting, even if just a little? Will you wait for the world to change on its own, or will you be the spark that ignites transformation in your own reality? Mandela's story isn't just about politics. It's about choice. Choosing to forgive when it's easier to hate. Choosing to resist when it's easier to surrender. Choosing to dream, even when everything says it won't work. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this message with someone who needs to hear that it's still worth fighting, with wisdom, courage, and purpose.